It was the spring of 1944, and the sun over Boise Army Airfield in Idaho had already begun to bake the tarmac by mid-morning. Rows of B-17 flying fortresses gleamed beneath a cloudless sky, their massive bodies ready for deployment, their bellies loaded with the promise of destruction. For most of the young men stationed here, the war was a faraway inferno, but for one man, it lived beneath his fingernails, in the grease on his hands, in the echo of broken engines he couldn't unhear. Corporal Eli Madsen wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the hangar, much less the interior workings of a B-17 bomber. Just 6 months earlier, he had been an airframe repair technician assigned to Fort MacArthur, until a procedural insubordination charge had cost him his clearance and nearly landed him in a military prison. He wasn't defiant by nature, but when a general's son nearly died mid-flight because of a design flaw Eli had warned about, he couldn't keep silent. His report had been buried. The fix had been ignored. And when the brass learned he had made unapproved adjustments to a test aircraft, they shipped him off to Boise to fade into obscurity. But Eli didn't fade. He observed, quietly, relentlessly. Every day after his assigned maintenance duties ended, he lingered in the hangar, pretending to clean tools or inventory parts. But really he was listening to the pilots, to the mechanics, to the rumors about bombers coming back torn open like sardine cans, about gunners shredded by flak, about missions aborted because oxygen systems failed above 10,000 feet. One particular story kept circling like a vulture dot in the last 4 months. 7 B-17s had returned with dead tail gunners. Not wounded dead, in nearly identical circumstances. The tail section had absorbed enemy fire as expected, but the gunner had either bled out before the plane could land or suffocated. Most reports said it was just part of the risk. But to Eli, the pattern wasn't just tragic, it was mechanical. He started drawing in a weathered composition notebook he kept hidden under the floorboards of his bunk. He diagrammed the airflow patterns of the tail section. He cross-referenced them with damage reports. He created alternate oxygen tank placements, redesigned panel reinforcements, even sketched a collapsible armor shell he believed could reduce fatal shrapnel injuries by 40%. He wasn't an engineer. He had no authority. But he had eyes, and he had obsession. Then came the night the base went silent. It was a Thursday. A bomber from the 96th Squadron landed short, its rear landing gear shredded, tail dragging a long scar into the earth. They pulled the crew out on stretchers. The tail gunner was dead. Again. This time it was Sergeant Julian Marks 21 from Nebraska. Eli had seen him 2 days earlier, joking in the mess hall. Now his face was a smear of blood and bone under a canvas sheet. Something in Eli snapped. He waited until 0200 hours, slipped into Hangar 3, climbed into the tail section of an inactive B-17 under the guise of ventilation maintenance, and he started cutting. He had memorized the design, knew where to avoid the load-bearing ribs. He reinforced the oxygen line with a split conduit sleeve scavenged from a decommissioned C-47. He shifted the tank itself, bolting it closer to the gunner's left hip for faster reach. He installed a scrap armor panel beneath the seat, angled to deflect upward shrapnel. And then, without a word to anyone, he left. The next morning, that very aircraft tail number 2327 was scheduled for a routine supply run to Montana. It was never supposed to be in combat, but war has a way of changing plans. An emergency reroute placed it in a convoy, delivering munitions to a forward base outside London. 2 days later, over the English Channel, the plane was attacked by 3 FW-190s. The nose gunner was injured. The right wing took damage. But tail gunner Corporal Rhys Thomas held the line, taking out one enemy fighter and surviving a direct hit to the tail. He limped off the plane back in England, with a cracked rib and ringing ears but alive. The pilot's report said the tail section had absorbed 14 hits. The gunner's seat was pockmarked with shrapnel. The oxygen tank had a deep groove in it, but hadn't ruptured. The armor plate beneath the seat had split, but stopped the jagged edge of a shell. Eli's fix had worked. He expected nothing. Wanted no glory. But secrets don't stay secret on a base that's small dot by the end of the week. Rumors of a ghost mechanic had spread. Officers questioned the maintenance crew. Tools were audited. Hangars locked down at night. But no one suspected Eli, not yet. He continued his normal shifts, stayed quiet, and kept his drawings hidden. But then a colonel arrived from Reich Field. Colonel Simon Hanley was no ordinary brass. He had worked on the original B-17 design team. Tall, cold, surgical. He requested to inspect tail 2327 personally. He stayed 3 hours inside that plane. When he emerged, he asked one question. Who the hell did this? Eli didn't speak, not until he was summoned out, and when he was finally brought into the colonel's office. He didn't defend himself. He laid the notebook on the desk, opened it to page 1, and said, "I did it because no one else would." The colonel didn't touch the notebook. For several seconds, the office remained silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of engines from the tarmac outside. Eli stood like a man already convicted. Colonel Hanley sat like a surgeon preparing to decide whether the patient should live or die. "You understand what you've done?" Hanley asked without looking up. "Yes, sir." Unauthorized modifications. Unauthorized access to aircraft. Violation of military code. And if this had failed, if your little experiment had killed Corporal Thomas. It didn't. Eli cut in, too quickly. Hanley's eyes rose. Cold as steel. "You think this is about whether it worked, Corporal?" Eli clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He'd prepared himself for this moment, imagined it 100 different ways. Sometimes they threw him in the stockade. Sometimes they shipped him to Leavenworth. Once, in his most hopeful version, someone in command actually listened. But none of those versions had prepared him for what came next. Hanley opened the notebook page by page. He flipped through Eli's diagrams. His fingers paused on a reinforcement bracket drawing, on the airflow redesign, on a schematic of a rear oxygen bypass loop. He said nothing, just scanned, absorbed. His poker face never cracked until he reached the final page. It was labeled simply, Phase 2, Modular Gunner Pod Concept. "Where the hell did you get this idea?" Hanley muttered. "I built it in my head," Eli said. "It started when I saw the casualty reports from late 43, all the tail gunners. Same injuries. Same oxygen failures. The angle of flak entry, the seat position, the tank placement, it all pointed to a structural flaw in how the B-17's rear was designed. You just rewrote Boeing's design manual?" The colonel barked. "I just tried to save lives." Hanley leaned back, expression unreadable. "We'll see about that." For the next week, Eli disappeared from regular duty. He wasn't arrested, not officially. But he wasn't released either. He was moved to a secure building near the edge of the base, a former intelligence outpost with no signage and a single locked door. 2 guards posted outside. Inside, a metal chair, a desk, and a rotating team of officers' engineers. Logistics men, safety auditors, all asking questions. Where had he learned aeronautics? Why hadn't he gone through proper channels? Did anyone else help him? Who else knew? Eli answered everything honestly. He had no formal engineering background. Just books, observations, experience, and a brain that wouldn't let go of patterns until he unraveled them. No one helped him. Yes, a few mechanics might have noticed something odd. But no one else was involved. The interrogations grew less hostile by the day. Eventually, they brought him schematics. Asked for clarification. A colonel from the Army Air Force's Materiel Division flew in from Dayton. And someone from the Office of Strategic Services appeared, a civilian in a gray suit, who asked only 2 questions. Can your design be replicated? Would it make a difference? To both, Eli said yes. And then things shifted. Eli was moved again, this time not to isolation, but to Hangar 7, a restricted development bay on the north side of the base. Sealed behind barbed wire and guarded by MPs. Inside, he found something he never expected, a prototype team. There were 7 of them. Engineers, draftsmen, a metallurgist, a systems analyst, all civilians under Army contract. And in the middle of their cluttered work table sat a model of his redesign. Not just a sketch, not just a drawing. A full-scale rear gunner pod, built in aluminum, glass, and steel. Welcome to the real war, one of the engineers said. Shaking his hand, they didn't treat Eli like a corporal. They treated him like an asset, a mind. Over the next 6 weeks, they worked side by side, refining the design, stress testing it in wind tunnels, reconfiguring oxygen flows, reinforcing weak points with new alloys. They debated heat tolerance, vibration decay, ballistic resistance. Eli barely slept. He didn't want to. For the first time since the war began, he felt useful not just fixing what was broken, but building something to keep others from breaking. Then came the test flight, June 12, 1944. A modified B-17, designated Project Shelter 2, was rolled out at dawn. Only 2 people on board knew the full extent of the changes. The pilot, Captain Laura Fremont, and the tail gunner, Sergeant Eric Molloy. The others were told only that it was a systems validation run. Eli stood on the edge of the runway, chewing his nails raw, watching the plane lift into the sky. The flight path looped over Idaho, then west toward the Oregon border, then circled back. Midway through, a simulated enemy encounter was triggered. 2 P-51s played aggressors, firing blanks and low-grade flares. The tail section absorbed vibration, minor shock impacts, sudden drops. Sensors recorded everything. When the plane landed 2 hours later, Eli sprinted to the tarmac. Molloy stepped out of the tail section smiling. That's the first time I ever felt safe back there, he said. The data confirmed it. Oxygen flow remained stable even at high G turns. Shock absorption reduced internal impact force by 27%. The armored panel deflected every simulated shell. Most telling of all, Molloy's heart rate stayed lower than any previous tail gunner on record during a mock encounter. The team erupted in quiet cheers. Eli didn't. He stared at the plane, then at the clipboard of data. And he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a much bigger fight, because the Army might have tolerated one mechanic's miracle fix, but accepting it as standard? Admitting their billion-dollar aircraft had a fatal flaw? That would take more than evidence. It would take politics. 2 weeks after the successful test, the project vanished from all official records. The engineers were reassigned to Routine Maintenance Group 12. The prototype was rolled into a closed hangar and covered with tarps. No announcements. No technical memos. No celebration. The war machine had absorbed a miracle and then pretended it didn't happen. Eli didn't understand at first. He assumed they were preparing for mass production. But when his base pass was revoked and his orders redirected to a logistics depot in Utah, the truth began to take shape. Someone higher up didn't want his work spreading. Someone who thought admitting a design flaw would make the Army Air Forces look weak, or worse, liable. He packed his duffel in silence and boarded the transport truck without protest. It wasn't the first time innovation had been buried under bureaucracy. But this time, he couldn't let it go dot at the depot. His job was mindless, inventorying crates, logging spare parts, ensuring nothing disappeared. He worked 12-hour days surrounded by grease, paper, and the low hum of generators. No aircraft, no engines, no purpose. His hands felt too clean, his head too loud, and every night he'd dream of that tail gunner's armor plate, splitting but holding, saving a man's life in a sky of fire. Then one afternoon, while cataloging hydraulic pumps, a sergeant from the communications bay found him. "There's someone asking for you," the man said. "From England." Eli frowned. "England?" "Yeah, some colonel. Says it's urgent." He followed the sergeant to the comms tent. The line crackled, transatlantic interference hissing between words. A voice came through, rough and tired, but unmistakably firm. "Madsen? This is Colonel Richard Porter, 94th Bomb Group, RAF Bassingbourn. I don't know what the hell you did to those tail sections, but I've got pilots and gunners asking me to find you. Whatever fix you made, it's keeping men alive. We just lost 12 aircraft over Bremen, but the modified ones came back. All of them." Eli froze. "Modified ones? I only worked on one prototype." Porter hesitated. "Then somebody's been copying your work. You've started something, son, and I don't think Command's too happy about it." The line went dead. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He knew what this meant. Someone from the Idaho test group must have leaked the blueprints, or maybe just told another mechanic how it was done. Either way, word had spread across the Atlantic. The field crews were improvising, building Madsen pods from scrap metal and spare tubing, unofficial, unapproved, but working. The next morning, he wrote a letter. To the men keeping planes in the air, it began, "Don't wait for permission. The manual won't save them. The fix will." He described the structural reinforcement pattern, the oxygen relocation, the armor angle, the vent alignment. He even drew the simplified version that could be installed using basic hangar tools. He sealed the envelope, addressed it to Engineering Officer, 94th Bomb Group, RAF Bassingbourn, and mailed it through base post with no return address. 3 weeks later, he received an anonymous envelope in return. No sender. Just one line of handwriting inside. "It works. You saved them." And a photograph, black and white, grainy but clear. A smiling tail gunner beside a patched B-17 with the words "Baby Ruth 2" painted under the cockpit. The armor panel behind him bore the distinctive angled reinforcement Eli had drawn. It was spreading dot by August 1944. Allied bombers were returning from missions in numbers that stunned analysts. The Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft network hadn't weakened, yet casualty ratios shifted. Less fatal tail hits, fewer decompressions. Field reports mentioned localized armor augmentation, modified oxygen placement, and manual redundancies. All unofficial, all untraceable, but the data didn't lie. Meanwhile, at Wright Field in Ohio, headquarters noticed a report labeled "Internal Use Only," circulated through Engineering Command. Unverified mechanical alterations detected on aircraft from the 91st, 94th, and 303rd Bomb Groups. Unauthorized structural modifications affecting weight, center of gravity, and airflow. Potential safety concerns. Investigation recommended. Eli never saw that memo, but he felt its consequences. His mail was intercepted. His shift schedule changed. One night, 2 plainclothes officers appeared at his barracks, asking about correspondence with overseas personnel. He denied everything. They didn't believe him, but they couldn't prove anything either. There were no fingerprints on the letters, no witnesses, no paper trail. They left with warnings. He was to remain at his post, avoid contact with aircrew, and refrain from discussing any prior engineering activities. He nodded, said he understood, then went back to work. For a month, he obeyed. Then a transport pilot came through Utah for refueling a kid maybe 22, all bones and freckles. He spotted Eli's namatag, froze, then saluted. Double quotes, sir. Are you the one who built the Safetail mod? Eli blinked. I know. That's just something the mechanics. The pilot shook his head. We called it the Madsen fix. My brother's plane took a flak burst outside Hamburg. Lost half the tail. He made it home because of your design. He wanted me to tell you thank you. Eli's throat went dry. What's his name? Lieutenant Mark Tully, 94th Group. The kid handed him a folded photograph. Eli unfolded it slowly. 2 airmen stood beside a wrecked tail section patched with crude armor panels. One man had a bandaged arm. The other was missing his left boot. Both were grinning like they'd cheated death. Eli stared at the photo until his hands trembled. That night, he wrote again, this time not to England, but to the U.S. Army Air Forces Command. The letter was polite, restrained, but firm. Gentlemen, I am aware that my modifications were unauthorized. I accept any punishment necessary. But please understand men are copying these fixes because they work. They are saving lives in combat conditions. If the engineers at Wright Field wish to review the design, I will cooperate fully. I ask only that the modifications be standardized before more airmen die needlessly. He never received a reply. What he didn't know was that his letter arrived the same week. Boeing's lobby representatives met with Air Force procurement officers. The B-17 line was already being phased out in favor of the B-29. No one wanted to admit the older bomber had design weaknesses. The Madsen fix threatened not just reputations, it threatened contracts. The file was stamped, classified, non-essential, and Eli Madsen's name disappeared from all further correspondence. Back in Utah, the war dragged on. Each day he inventoried boxes of hydraulic valves, oxygen regulators, and scrap metal items identical to the parts he'd once used to build his life-saving systems. The irony was unbearable. He couldn't fix planes anymore. He could only count the pieces of them, but others hadn't stopped. Word from Europe spread through the mechanic grapevine low, whispered, impossible to trace. Dozens of squadrons were now modifying their planes in defiance of orders. Some even carved the letter M on their tail sections as a quiet sign of respect. The brass ignored it publicly, but privately, data analysts started to notice patterns. Crews flying unmarked bombers returned home more often. Mission after mission, the statistics held. Eli had started a revolution he would never be allowed to see. The war ended with a bang no mechanic could have engineered. 2, in fact. Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned through the fabric of history, and in the wake of those atomic flashes, the world recalibrated. Europe was dust and silence. The Pacific was smoke and surrender. And Eli Madsen was still in Utah, pushing crates of spare tail assemblies no one needed anymore. The B-29 had taken the skies. The B-17 was obsolete, and the fix he had spent his life building had officially never existed. The orders came down in September. Inventory disposal, they called it. Translation: burn everything that wasn't needed for peacetime logistics. Thousands of crates marked non-essential were hauled into the desert, doused in fuel, and turned to ash. Eli watched his own sketches, duplicates of a design that had saved hundreds of airmen, curl into black flakes, caught by the wind. A captain walked past, nodding toward the flames. Feels good to clean house, doesn't it? Eli didn't respond. He kept his hands in his pockets, his eyes on the fire, and felt the heat of 1,000 forgotten names rise toward the stars. He left the service quietly. No medal ceremony, no parade, just a signature on a form and a ride back to Nebraska in the back of a train car. He returned to his father's old garage, now shuttered with rusted hinges and vines. He opened the doors and found silence. The tools were still there. The dust was deeper. The memories heavier. For the next year, Eli tried to live like a man who hadn't changed history. He fixed tractors, rebuilt carburetors, took apart radios for neighbors who still believed tubes could outlive transistors. But something inside him had cracked. Every time he saw a plane in the sky, he wondered if the man flying it knew how close he had come to dying before a wrench changed everything. It wasn't until 1947, when a letter arrived in a worn envelope with no return address, that the silence broke again. Inside was a photograph, black and white, faded at the edges. It showed 6 men in uniform standing beside a parked B-17 on a rainy runway in England. Across the fuselage, someone had painted the words "Safe Haven." The tail section bore his signature reinforcement pattern, clearly visible even in the blur. And on the back of the photo, in small handwriting, "Your fix. Our lives. We never forgot." There was no name, no explanation, but the weight of it crashed into Eli like flak. He stared at the image for hours. That night, he unlocked the garage and cleared off the old workbench. He pulled out a fresh notebook and began redrawing everything from memory. Every angle, every rivet, every oxygen reroute. If no one else would preserve the truth, he would dot in 1952. A young aviation enthusiast named Jim Foster, studying at Purdue University, stumbled across Eli's name in a footnote of a B-17 maintenance manual. Just one mention, buried in a paragraph about unauthorized field modifications. Intrigued, Jim tracked him down. He found Eli hunched over an engine block in Nebraska, grease on his elbows, eyes weary but alert. When Jim introduced himself and asked about the Madsen fix, Eli just laughed. Thought the Army burned that idea out of history. They might have tried, Jim said, but the mechanics didn't. Over the next few weeks, Eli told Jim everything. Not in pride, but in duty. He showed him the drawings, the letters, the photos. He explained the failures, the breakthroughs, the lives saved. Jim recorded every word, wrote it down, and made copies. When he asked Eli why he never fought for recognition, the old mechanic just shrugged. "I didn't do it to be remembered. I did it so they'd get to come home." Jim eventually wrote a thesis called Ghost Wrenches, the unofficial engineers of the U.S. Air Force. It was never published, but a single chapter made its way into the archives at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. And there, tucked in a box labeled Field Modifications, unconfirmed, was a copy of Eli Madsen's original blueprint, folded. Fragile, but real. Years passed. Eli never married, never had kids. But his garage became a sanctuary for young mechanics, curious minds, and restless pilots looking for someone who understood the language of engines and the silence of guilt. They came not for glory, but for guidance, and found it in a man who spoke with quiet authority and carried no need for applause. In 1975, at the age of 63, Eli suffered a stroke while repairing the brakes on an old Hudson. He collapsed on the gravel and died before the ambulance arrived. His funeral was modest. A flag, a prayer, a few aging veterans in uniform. The town barely noticed, but 2 weeks later, a group of retired B-17 crewmen organized a flyover. They came in from Ohio, Texas, California, some in wheelchairs, some with oxygen tanks. They flew in a restored flying fortress called Iron Faith. Painted beneath the tail section in crisp white lettering were the words, Madsen Fix, Field Approved. The town didn't understand. The local paper called it a tribute to a local mechanic. But those who served knew better. Eli Madsen hadn't been just a mechanic. He had been a ghost in the machine, the kind of man who rewrote fate with a socket wrench and a sketch pad. A man who stood between the gears of war and said, "This doesn't have to end in fire." Eli's garage is still there. Locals say the new owner keeps the old bench untouched. They point to the faded photograph above it, 6 men beside a plane called Safe Haven. They say if you visit late at night, you can hear the hum of engines long gone, the whispered thanks of crewmen who never got the chance to shake his hand. The blueprint is now on display at the museum in Dayton, under a simple plaque, unofficial, unrecognized, unforgettable. And beneath that, in brass, in memory of Eli Madsen, the man who fixed what others ignored,